A dog walked into a police station, and what happened next is unbelievable. A dog walked into the Lincoln Heights police station on a Monday night at exactly 11 minutes past midnight, and nobody in that pristine, fluorescent-lit lobby could imagine what would happen next. It was late, the station was quiet, and the few officers on duty were mostly dealing with paperwork or half-hearted phone calls. Then came the moment that no one would ever forget. The dull click of the front door swinging open, the echo of cautious paws against the polished tiles, and a collective intake of breath among the officers who saw a large, mud-spattered dog step inside. The disbelief was immediate. Dogs rarely wander into police stations, and when they do, it's typically an accident, a slip-in behind a civilian or a drifter. But this dog had come in alone, purposeful. Something about him signaled he hadn't just wandered in, he had arrived. Tall and lean, with a coat somewhere between a dull black and a deep brown, the dog had eyes that radiated a quiet intelligence. He glanced around once, twice, as though making sure he was in the right place, then took a few tentative steps forward. An officer leaned forward from behind the reception desk, expecting the dog to bolt away any second. But the dog kept walking, tail lowered, not fearful but resolved. That kind of self-possession in an animal immediately sparked curiosity. The dog had patches of caked mud on its paws, a smudge of something suspiciously close to dried blood on its flank, and its mouth hung open in a panting, weary grimace. For a few seconds nobody moved, partly out of shock, partly out of some unspoken sense that this moment needed to be handled gently. Finally, Officer Jackson, a young recruit who'd been on the night shift for only 6 months, stood up from his desk. He walked around the counter slowly, hands extended in front of him as if approaching a skittish horse. He didn't say anything at first, just inched closer. The dog met his gaze with unnerving calm, as if it had been waiting all night to make eye contact with an officer. Without warning, the dog turned, walked behind a row of plastic chairs lined against the wall, sat down and stared at Jackson. Its stare was both a request and a command, a silent plea for help, and also an urgent demand for immediate action. Officer Jackson knelt down, murmuring softly, "Hey, buddy, are you all right?" He carefully scanned the dog's body for injuries. The dog flinched at the brush near its side, letting out a faint whimper. That was when Jackson noticed the crusted wound just above the back leg. It looked like it might have been a graze, possibly from a bullet. A ripple of alarm shot through Jackson's body. He yelled out to the other officers, "Hey, somebody get me a first aid kit, I think he's hurt." As Jackson reached for the dog's collar, there was none. The dog started shifting restlessly, almost like he was trying to guide Jackson somewhere. By the time Sergeant Price, a more senior officer, approached with a small medical kit, the dog stood and strode to the door, then looked over its shoulder. It was every inch the universal sign for "follow me." Jackson and Price exchanged glances. "This is bizarre," Price muttered, "but maybe we should see where he wants to lead us." They were cops, after all. They were used to improbable scenarios, to random leads and bizarre tips. Yet there was something about this dog, an urgency, a fear, and a firm determination in those wide, sorrowful eyes. Price went into the back office, grabbed a service flashlight, then motioned to Jackson. "Let's go. If the dog's leading us somewhere, we might as well check it out. But be careful. Call for backup if it looks suspicious." The two men followed the dog out into the crisp night air. A couple of other officers quickly realized something odd was happening and joined them. The dog set a brisk pace down the street, ignoring the scattered traffic and the occasional look from a late-night passerby. Up ahead, the dog paused at an intersection, looked left, then right, before suddenly taking off to the left, its stride accelerating into a limping run. Jackson's heart pounded with an inexplicable sense of foreboding. He'd never followed an animal with such conviction before. They continued for 7 blocks, an unexpected, almost surreal journey through dimly lit streets and flickering neon signs. Finally, the dog led them to a deserted construction site. Razor wire fencing surrounded half-built structures, stacks of bricks, and towering cranes that seemed to loom in the darkness like silent guardians of a secret. The dog squeezed through a gap in the fence. Jackson and Price forced the fence open a bit more, ignoring the wire's barbs as they slipped inside. The dog paced forward, weaving past a pile of discarded beams and a collapsed section of a half-finished wall. There was a hole, large enough for a person to slip through, partially hidden by planks and debris. Inside the partial structure was a hallway leading to what looked like a basement area. Jackson's flashlight caught a glint of something on the ground. An earring, a small silver cross. Then he saw the shoe, partially covered in dust, the outline of a foot still in it. He froze, a wave of horror rolling over him. Price immediately radioed for backup, voice tight with tension. The dog pressed on, descending carefully into the subterranean labyrinth. Below, the air was damp and pungent with mildew. A thin squeaking of rats echoed from some hidden corner. The dog hesitated, as if searching for the right way, and then trotted down a corridor to the left. The corridor opened up into a hollow chamber. Scattered across the floor were personal items, a battered purse, a child's hairbrush, a phone with a cracked screen. The dog padded into the center of the room and let out a low, mournful howl. It was a sound that seized Jackson's chest like a vice. He found himself glancing around, a flashlight beam dancing on wet, crumbling walls. Moments later, his light fell on a shape in the corner. A person. Jackson rushed forward, nearly stumbling over the rubble. It was a woman, perhaps in her mid-30s. She was battered, bruised, conscious but delirious, eyes half open. She looked up at them, tried to speak, but could barely manage a whisper. Jackson immediately called for paramedics. The woman clutched at Jackson's arm, tears streaming down her face, but the tears weren't just of terror or relief. There was a deeper despair in them, as though she'd been expecting no rescue at all. Officer Price moved his flashlight around the chamber, dread mounting in every breath. He called out, "Is there anyone else down here?" Echoes fluttered against the concrete. Then Jackson thought he heard a muffled cry. He aimed his flashlight toward a shadowy alcove near the back. Indeed, there was another corridor, narrower, with rebar jutting from the walls. The dog beat them to it, bounding ahead with a renewed burst of energy. When Jackson followed, he almost retched at the stench. Something foul lingered here, death, decay, or worst of all, that intangible sense of atrocities committed in the dark. And in that corridor they found them. Half a dozen more people, 2 children, a teenager and 3 adults. Most were tied or chained, trembling, half-conscious from dehydration and fear. Some cried at the sight of the flashlights and uniformed officers. Others just gazed with hollow eyes, as if they could no longer distinguish between reality and nightmares. The dog frantically sniffing each person, gently nudging them as if telling them it was all right now, that help had come. Jackson and Price called in every available unit. Within minutes, sirens wailed and the area became a hive of activity. Firefighters cut through chains and paramedics treated wounds. Detectives arrived, stepping around the debris. The site was locked down for an immediate investigation. As the lights of ambulances and police cruisers flickered against the high concrete walls, that dog, this strange, heroic dog, sat quietly by the entrance, watching everything unfold with an unblinking gaze. In the swirl of frantic activity, no one quite remembered to secure him. No one asked who owned him or why he was wounded, nor did they realize the magnitude of what they would uncover in the coming days. That night, all they knew was that a dog had led them to the liberation of multiple kidnap victims. And as extraordinary as that was, they had no inkling that this was only the beginning of something far more harrowing. The dog was taken to a nearby clinic that the police sometimes used for their K-9 units. A kind-hearted veterinarian named Doctor was called from his after-hours number. He cleaned the dog's wound, bandaged it, and set up a drip for IV fluids. Officer Jackson stayed by the dog's side. He didn't know exactly why he felt so drawn to this animal, but there was something in the dog's eyes that resembled gratitude and sorrow. The dog had no collar, no microchip. Doctor guessed he was about 3 or 4 years old, likely a cross between a Labrador retriever and a hound. Jackson named him Shadow for the way he seemed to appear quietly in the night and lead them through darkness. Shadow didn't resist being treated, never snapped at the vet or showed aggression despite his obvious pain. Once stabilized, Shadow was brought to the police station, where a makeshift bed of blankets was arranged in a corner. People milled around him, offering treats or a comforting pat, but Shadow maintained a calm distance, as if waiting for something else, some unspoken resolution. The rescued victims began telling their stories to the detectives. It all had an air of a waking nightmare. Some had been missing for days, others for weeks. A couple had been abducted from different parts of the city or even from neighboring towns. Their accounts suggested that they had been held by a group of extremely dangerous individuals, part of a human trafficking ring. The basement they'd been discovered in wasn't even their original holding place. They'd been moved there just 2 days prior. No one knew why. The police jumped into action, analyzing every shred of evidence. And the dog, having delivered them to that basement, could have easily faded into the background, a heroic footnote. But something else was going on. Shadow was restless. Over the next few days, as the station whirred with activity, detectives trying to connect dots, forensics analyzing the crime scene, the media swirling around the miracle rescue, Shadow grew increasingly anxious. He paced near the station's entrance and whined at night, as though he sensed that the real danger wasn't over. It was only intensifying, lurking out there in the darkness. One evening, Detective arrived on the scene. Was known for her razor-sharp instincts, her ability to notice the subtlest clues. She'd been assigned to a parallel investigation involving missing persons and suspected police corruption. Upon meeting Shadow, crouched down, rubbed his ears gently and said, "You're the talk of the station, you know that, boy." Shadow pressed his muzzle against her hand, exhaling in a soft huff. It felt almost like an apology that he'd not yet shown them everything. Had read the preliminary reports about the trafficking ring bust. Something about the timeline didn't add up. The captives had been moved recently, but why risk relocating them to that partially built site? Sure, it was remote, but it was hardly secure, and eventually some construction workers might stumble across them. This suggested the captors were desperate or had an urgent reason to relocate. With her curiosity piqued, pored over city records, building permits, and even phone calls made from that area in the last week. Late one night, after nearly dozing off at her cluttered desk, she remembered the dog and the bullet graze he'd endured. Could it be that the people behind the kidnapping had run into Shadow and fired at him? Or was Shadow escaping from them? The question wouldn't let her rest. When visited the kennel area where Shadow was temporarily being kept, she found him wide awake, ears perked, watching her intently as she approached. She sat on the floor next to him. "Where'd you come from, buddy? What are you trying to tell us?" That was the moment Shadow rose to his feet, pressed his snout against the chain-link barrier, and let out a series of short, sharp barks. Then he pawed the gate, stepped back and looked at her expectantly. Blinked. She felt a chill spider walk up her spine, because somehow, even though it was illogical, the dog looked at her in a way that made her believe he wanted her to follow him again. But where? Early the next morning convinced her captain to let her take Shadow out on a leash. Officially, it was just exercise, but had a hunch. She carefully secured a lead around the dog's neck, trying not to spook him. The moment they stepped outside the station, Shadow tried to take off with a tug. He clearly had a destination in mind. Scrambled to keep up, jogging as Shadow led her through side streets. Anyone who saw them might have laughed at the sight. A detective in being towed by a dog. But's heart pounded, not from exertion, but from an uncanny mix of fear and anticipation. Shadow guided her across a highway overpass, down an embankment, and into an abandoned industrial park. noticed that the metal gates bore old signage from a defunct shipping company that had gone under years ago. Debris was scattered everywhere: broken glass, twisted metal, plastic tarps flapping in the wind. The place smelled of stale oil and rotting wood. Kept one hand on her holster, the other on the leash. Shadow's hackles went up, his nostrils flaring. He lowered his head, then made a beeline for a derelict warehouse near the far corner of the lot. Inside, everything was dust and darkness. Flicked on her flashlight. Thick, airborne particles danced in the beam. The floor was littered with torn cardboard boxes and scraps of rope. The reek of decay was even worse here. His throat tightened as she remembered the stench from the basement. Shadow padded slowly, more cautiously now, stepping around broken pallets. Suddenly he froze, ears erect, tail rigid. Raised her gun. Her flashlight swept across a row of battered crates, revealing a figure slumped against the far wall, a man. His breath caught. Was he unconscious or worse? She approached, heart hammering, flashlight trembling in her hand. The man was alive but badly beaten. Blood caked his temple. His eyes flickered at the intrusion of light. He tried to speak, but only a raspy croak emerged. Called for backup immediately, dropping to her knees to check his pulse and examine his wounds. Shadow stood guard, issuing a low growl toward the darkness, as if sensing more danger. Found a wallet in the man's pocket. His driver's license identified him as a local journalist who'd been missing for 2 weeks. The next few hours were a blur of sirens, paramedics, and frantic communications. Was rushed to the hospital. He'd apparently stumbled onto evidence of widespread corruption, including high-ranking officials colluding with criminals. He'd been abducted and tortured for information. In his delirious babbling, he repeated something about police involvement, someone at the top, and there, after the evidence. Began to suspect that the rescue of those trafficking victims was only part of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that Shadow seemed to be unraveling, piece by piece. In the ensuing days, stabilized enough to speak with. What she learned chilled her to the core. He claimed that a powerful network of individuals, some in law enforcement, others in local government, were facilitating these criminal activities. Bribes, hush money, tampered evidence, and blackmail had allowed a hidden empire of trafficking and drug smuggling to flourish. When tried to go public, he was taken. His abductors had moved him around several times, uncertain of where to keep him hidden. Eventually, he found a chance to escape. That was when they shot at him. He wasn't sure what happened next, only that he remembered hearing a dog barking somewhere in the confusion. Could that have been Shadow? Wondered if Shadow had encountered during that incident, had followed the scent of violence until the dog could lead the police to him. The station buzzed with the possibility that something massive was amiss. Captain Brooks, usually unflappable, looked stricken when presented him with the broad strokes. Criminals in the shadows, corrupt officials, kidnappings, illegal trafficking, and a dog who seemed to be an unwitting hero in the middle of it all. The captain authorized a special investigative unit. The newly rescued victims were questioned intensively. Some recalled hearing their captors talk about fixers in the police force who handled inconvenient evidence. Others mentioned a recurring name, though they were too traumatized to recall details. Cerberus, an odd name that carried a sense of menace. Cerberus, new from Greek mythology, was the monstrous watchdog that guarded the gates of the underworld. A cruel irony that a dog of good was now guiding them to unravel the dark secrets of a criminal ring named after that fearsome hound. Throughout all this, Shadow remained at the station. Officers took turns feeding him and giving him a warm place to sleep. Some joked that he should be given an honorary badge. Yet despite the gentle pats and coaxing, Shadow never seemed truly relaxed. Late at night, caught him pacing, whining softly. She felt the tension too, this mounting sense that the dog knew they were on the verge of discovering something devastating. Only a week after was found, the phone rang in its office. On the other end was a trembling voice that refused to give a name. The caller spoke in hushed tones, muffled by obvious fear. They claimed to have information about Cerberus and said they would meet at a certain address that night. If the detective came alone, the caller promised undeniable proof of the conspiracy. Hesitated. Everything about it screamed trap, but the voice sounded terrified, and the details matched certain leads they had uncovered. Agreed, but she wasn't about to go in unprepared. She informed the captain and arranged for discreet backup. As darkness fell, she found Shadow whining at the station door, straining at the leash an officer held. Hesitated for a moment, then decided she would bring Shadow along. It might be unorthodox, but the dog had an uncanny ability to sense danger and lead them to the truth. The backup unit stayed a block away and approached the meeting spot in her unmarked car, Shadow at her side. The address was an abandoned motel near the industrial zone, walls covered in graffiti, windows boarded up. The neon sign was half-shattered, flickering ominously. Stepped out, scanned the empty lot and parted a rusted chain-link gate. Shadow followed on a short leash, ears perked, eyes sharp. His nerves were on a knife edge. She pressed her foot into broken glass on the pavement, heart pounding so loudly she was sure it could be heard by anyone lurking. She whispered into her hidden mic, letting the backup know she was proceeding. Inside the motel courtyard, a single overhead light buzzed and crackled. Trash littered the ground. The place smelled of stale urine and old soot. Heard a moan, soft, pain drifting from one of the rooms. Shadow pulled toward the sound. Carefully upholstered her weapon, creeping forward. She found a door ajar, the chipped paint flaking off. With her free hand, she nudged it open. Her flashlight revealed a figure sprawled on the floor. In the dim light, she recognized the same trembling voice she'd heard on the phone. The contact. They were hurt, possibly assaulted. Hurried over, checking for vital signs. The contact was alive but struggling to speak. Their eyes were filled with terror, and with what little strength they had, they whispered a warning. "They know you're close, so close, get out." Before could respond, headlights blazed across the windows. Shadows shifted on the walls. Gunshots ripped through the flimsy boards, dropped to the floor, covering the contact's body with her own. Shadow barked furiously, a savage, guttural sound that bounced off the motel's walls. Its radio crackled with frantic shouts. Her backup team realized they'd been ambushed. More bullets tore into the motel's facade, splintering wood and sending shards of plaster raining down. Crawled to the corner, pressing a trembling hand to her mic. "Backup, request immediate emergency assistance. Hostiles on site, we're pinned down." Outside, the backup units engaged in a firefight with unknown assailants. Pressed herself against the corner as gunfire erupted in staccato bursts. The contact lay unconscious now, pulse faint. She tried to think, was there a way out through another room? If she could just get to the hallway, a bullet whizzed by her ear, lodging into the rotted frame with a dull thud. Shadow darted around, barking and growling, but yanked him back to keep him from taking a stray shot. Then came a lull, silence as the muzzle flashes stopped. His backup must have taken out at least one shooter or driven them momentarily back. Gripping the contact by the shoulders, half dragged, half carried them out into the corridor. Shadow led the way, nose low to the ground, as though he were tracking the path with the least exposure. His heart thundered in her throat. She could hear footsteps and shouting from outside, see the flicker of police lights. She risked it, sprinted across the courtyard, keeping low. A few more shots rang out, bullets pinging off a dumpster, but then uniformed officers swarmed in. The hail of bullets subsided. One of the shooters fled in a dark SUV, tires screeching. Another was taken into custody. Collapsed against a squad car, panting, arms still around the contact, who was quickly lifted onto a stretcher by paramedics. Shadow trembled at her side, adrenaline surging through him. The dog's eyes glinted with a mix of fear and fury, stroked his head shakily. "You saved us," she whispered. "You helped me find them and you kept me safe." The detainee, cornered by the backup, turned out to be a low-level operative for Cerberus. Upon interrogation, he revealed a partial web of alliances involving city officials, a handful of officers and wealthy backers who used under-the-table deals to fortify a sprawling trafficking and corruption racket. The detainee also confessed to receiving orders to kill that night. He sneered that had meddled too deeply, and Cerberus doesn't forgive. The name sent chills through the station. Everyone in that building had realized by now that they were facing something monstrous, something that could infiltrate their ranks and manipulate entire city departments. In the weeks that followed, everything escalated. With the help of Captain Brooks, formed a tight-lipped, loyal group of officers she trusted implicitly. They operated in near secrecy, fearing moles. Shadow was granted more freedom at the station, becoming a quiet presence in the halls, as though he was a sentinel standing guard. Whenever left for a stakeout or clandestine meeting, Shadow was at her side. Word spread across the precinct of the dog's uncanny instincts. More than once, he'd tug her away from a certain path or a suspicious person, alerting her to some unseen threat. Grew to rely on him, forging a bond that transcended mere pet-and-handler dynamics. It was as if the dog had a mission. He had come to that station with a purpose, and he wouldn't rest until the evil they were uncovering was purged. The deeper they dug, the more horrifying the evidence became. Computer records pointed to dozens, possibly hundreds, of missing individuals trafficked through hidden channels. Some ended up in forced labor, others in rings that human decency. The money trail led to offshore accounts, ties to unscrupulous officials, and rumors of an ultimate puppet master behind Cerberus. And all the while, the pressure on the honest cops intensified. Threatening letters showed up. Officer Jackson's car was vandalized. Price's wife received ominous messages. His home address was somehow leaked online. A sense of impending doom gripped them. But they pressed on, spurred by the memory of the rescued victims and the unwavering presence of Shadow, who seemed determined to help them break this network wide open. Then came a breakthrough. A forensic technician, after days of sifting through endless data, found a single repeated reference in communications from the captured suspects, an address in the outskirts of town, near a closed-down carnival ground. On a hunch, Price, Jackson, and a handful of other trustworthy officers prepared a raid. It would be a risk, but if their intel was correct, the address might be a major hub or even a meeting place for high-level Cerberus associates. Even Captain Brooks insisted on being part of the operation. He was done waiting in the wings. "We end this," he said simply. The night before the raid had a strange sensation like the quiet before a storm. She tried to sleep but kept waking up, heart racing. She dreamed of going back to that basement, the dog leading her through darkness, only to find not just a handful of captives, but entire corridors filled with people. In the dream, the dog barked and the walls collapsed, revealing that the entire city was built on a labyrinth of evil. She woke up in a sweat. Shadow was curled on the floor beside her bed. She'd taken him home for safety. He lifted his head, ears alert as though sensing her distress. "Tomorrow," she told him softly, "we're going to face them. I hope we're ready." When dawn broke, a grim determination settled over the station. The team assembled in an unmarked van. Shadow sat at its feet. She gave him a small pat and whispered, "If anything goes wrong, you get out okay." He looked up at her, unwavering, as if to say, "I stand with you." The van rolled through the city streets, heading for the abandoned carnival grounds. The rusted silhouette of a wheel rose in the distance, standing like a ghost of happier times. They parked a short distance away. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the crumbling carnival rides, tilted carousels, broken ticket booths, rotted wooden planks. It would have been almost picturesque if it weren't so hauntingly desolate. With weapons drawn, the officers spread out, each flank covered. Captain Brooks took a vantage point behind a dilapidated funnel cake stand, scanning the area with binoculars. With Shadow beside her, approached the building at the far corner of the carnival site, an old warehouse that once stored spare parts for the rides. Through the high windows they saw movement. Shadows flickered. Counted at least 8 people inside. This was it. Adrenaline surged in her veins. She signaled the others. One by one, officers positioned themselves around the perimeter. On count, they burst in, shouting for everyone to freeze. Instantly, chaos erupted. 4 suspects drew weapons, unleashing a hail of bullets. The echoing shots rebounded off the metal walls, stinging everyone's ears. Dove behind a forklift, returning fire. Price and Jackson flanked left, covering each other. Captain Brooks led another unit from the rear, hoping to corner the assailants. Shadow kept close to, pressed low to the ground. She shouted for him to stay back, but the dog, as though fueled by the urgency of the moment, sprang forward. A suspect tried to slip out a side door, brandishing a pistol. Shadow barreled into his legs, snarling, forcing him off balance. Rushed in and disarmed the man, zip-tying his wrists. The dog then darted back to his side. Across the warehouse, muzzle flashes lit up the gloom, accompanied by the acrid smell of gunpowder. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of screams, gunfire, and frantic barking. Finally, the barrage of bullets subsided. 4 suspects lay on the ground, disarmed, moaning in pain. 3 more had surrendered, hands behind their heads. One suspect, a tall figure in a dark suit, had managed to slip away in the mayhem. Spotted a side door hanging ajar. Without a second thought, she gave chase. Shadow bounded after her, ignoring her shouted command to stay. Outside, the last vestiges of twilight clung to the horizon. Followed the figure past a dilapidated roller coaster track, adrenaline pounding in her ears. The figure was agile, vaulting over a chain-link fence that separated the carnival from a wooded area. Climbed after him. Shadow scrambled beneath the fence, the chain-link rattling with tension. The figure vanished into the tree line. Drew her flashlight, scanning the gloom. Leaves crackled underfoot. Branches clawed at her arms. She pressed forward cautiously. A twig snapped to her left. She whirled, weapon raised. Then, without warning, she felt a sharp blow to her shoulder. She cried out as her flashlight clattered to the ground. The figure, tall, face hidden in the dimness, tried to wrest her gun away. They struggled violently, arms burning with the effort of keeping her hold. The figure hissed, "You should stayed out of this, detective. Cerberus can't be leashed." Their voices were cold, inhuman. Just then a furious growl ripped through the air. Shadow launched himself at the attacker, jaws closing on the man's forearm. The attacker howled in pain, loosening his grip on. She twisted free, aimed her gun. But the man knocked her weapon aside and lashed out with a vicious kick that caught Shadow's torso, sending the dog yelping to the ground. His throat constricted with horror. She lunged, tackling the attacker, both of them tumbling onto the forest floor. They grappled, rolling over roots and fallen leaves. Felt a knee slam into her ribs. She gasped, tasting blood. The attacker pressed a forearm into her throat, choking off her air. She clawed desperately at his arms, stars swimming in her vision. Suddenly, Shadow was on the man's back, snarling with a ferocity had never heard before. The attacker shrieked, thrashing. Shadow held on, teeth bared. Coughed, gulping in a ragged breath, then slammed the butt of her gun against the attacker's temple. He went limp, dropping face first into the dirt. Lay there for a moment, lungs heaving. Shadow nuzzled her cheek, whimpering softly, his tail thumping once in relief. She embraced him, tears mingling with dirt on her face. By the time the rest of the team arrived, had the man bound and unconscious. Her shoulder throbbed and she could barely catch her breath, but the mission was accomplished. They hauled the attacker back to the warehouse. Under the harsh beams of police headlights, finally saw the man's face clearly. Her heart plummeted. It was Deputy Chief, a high-ranking official in the department. It was true, then, someone from the very top was complicit. Worse yet, this might only be the tip of the iceberg. The next hours were a swirl of shouting, revelations, and heartbreak as the news spread across the force. Captain Brooks looked aged by a decade, grief-stricken at the betrayal by a brother in arms. Over time, broke under interrogation, naming several other officials and powerful business figures all tied to Cerberus. Arrests rolled out across the city. The media exploded with coverage. It was the biggest corruption scandal in decades. For too long, unscrupulous leaders had turned a blind eye to suffering, pocketing profits from human trafficking and more. And it had all come to light because a wounded, determined dog had walked into a police station that fateful midnight, refusing to let anyone ignore the horrors being committed in the city's shadows. In the aftermath, found herself standing at a podium, delivering a statement. Cameras clicked incessantly. She gave credit to the dedicated officers who refused to be bought, to the victims whose bravery in testifying had broken the case wide open, and to the dog named Shadow who led them to the first and most critical clue. The story went viral. Headlines blared about the dog who unearthed a city's darkest secret. People couldn't get enough of the unlikely hero. Citizen groups demanded that Shadow be recognized officially. And so, a ceremony was held outside the station where the mayor, free of corruption and eager to restore public faith, presented Shadow with an honorary medal. There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd when the dog, still sporting a healing scar from that vicious kick, wagged his tail nervously as the medal was placed around his neck. Yet the moment that lingered longest in everyone's hearts was after the crowd dispersed. Knelt by Shadow, her hand gently rubbing behind his ears. She looked into those eyes, which were as calm and unwavering as ever. "Thank you," she whispered, voice catching in her throat. Tears welled up. "You did more than save me. You saved countless others from a fate too horrible to imagine." Shadow simply bowed his head, letting out a soft huff, as if reminding her it wasn't about the medals, the applause, or even the newscasts. It was about doing what was right, chasing down evil until it had nowhere left to hide. In the weeks that followed, adopted Shadow permanently. She brought him into her home. Newspapers continued to churn out op-eds about the scandal for months. Multiple trials commenced. The uprooted corruption ring was dismantled, indicted piece by piece. The city began a slow, painful process of rebuilding trust in its institutions. Victims received resources for rehabilitation and reintegration. The journalist recovered and returned to his work, vowing to continue exposing injustice wherever it lurked. As for in Shadow, life settled into a new rhythm, but sometimes at night would wake up, heart pounding, thinking about how differently things might have turned out if not for the battered dog who limped into the station that midnight. She'd get out of bed and find Shadow in the living room, his ears perking up at her approach, tail giving a gentle thump. She'd kneel and press her forehead to his, the steady warmth of his body comforting her. It always amazed her how an animal with no words, no concept of laws or badges or court proceedings, had become the champion of justice. It was humbling, and it reminded her, day after day, that sometimes the most extraordinary heroes show up in ways that defy logic and expectations. The final, shocking postscript came nearly a year later. The city had largely moved on, Cerberus now a cautionary tale. Was going through cold case files on a quiet afternoon. She was scanning images of different kidnapping victims, piecing together patterns, when she stumbled upon a photo that made her blood run cold. A younger dog, very similar to Shadow, wearing a collar with a tag. The photo was from a missing persons report 5 years prior. A detective named Shaw had disappeared under mysterious circumstances while investigating potential corruption inside the department. In the background of one of the evidence photos, there was a dog that looked just like Shadow, except a bit smaller. The tag read Shadow. A jolt of realization shot through. Had Shadow belonged to that missing detective? The timeline was murky, but it was possible. Shaw had never been found. Some believed she'd been silenced by the same powerful forces that had brought down. Could Shadow have survived whatever happened to Shaw, roaming the streets, waiting for the right moment to surface with his final mission, to finish what his owner had started? The thought made breath catch. She stared at the old photograph, feeling a profound connection to a woman she never met. Maybe there was no definitive proof, but in her heart, she believed it. Shadow's unwavering devotion had transcended the boundary of years and heartbreak. Even after losing his original owner, he had returned to the one place he knew might pick up the cause of justice, the police station. Never told anyone about the photo. It felt too personal, too sacred. She simply went home that night, sat on her couch with Shadow at her side, and gently whispered, "You kept your promise to her, didn't you?" Shadow looked up, ears twitching at the tenderness in her voice. He rested his head in her lap. She stroked his fur, tears slipping down her cheeks. The city might have pinned a medal on him for a single heroic act, but she knew his real story went deeper, a testament to loyalty that refused to die, no matter how dark the night or how fearsome the enemy. That final revelation, that heartbreakingly poignant connection to Detective Shaw, was the note that never stopped echoing in his mind. Every time she stepped out on a new case, every time she found herself losing faith in the system or drowning in cynicism, she would remember how a single dog had toppled a fortress of corruption through sheer determination, and a heart that refused to abandon the ones it loved. And in that quiet, soul-stirring knowledge lay a truth that was, like the dog's arrival, unbelievable, miraculous, and utterly unforgettable. No one who heard the story could ever walk away unchanged. People shared it in hushed awe, posted it on social media with tearful reactions, retold it around dinner tables for years to come. How a dog walked into a police station one midnight, leading the officers down a path of danger and redemption. How it unveiled a conspiracy that reached to the highest ranks, brought down powerful men, and freed untold numbers of innocent victims. And above all, how it reminded the city that sometimes hope arrives in the shape, four-legged, silent, yet brimming with courage. It was a story that made people believe that no matter how deep the darkness runs, there will always be a light, even if it comes in the form of a stray dog with unwavering eyes, ready to guide them toward justice. And that was precisely why, when someone asked, "So, a dog walked into a police station, and what happened next?" people would say, "Something unbelievable, something life-changing, and something that proved heroes truly can come from anywhere, even the lonely streets, wounded and unspoken, carrying the torch of hope that refuses to be extinguished."